Thank you for tuning in to Andronetalks Radio, gathering as one in our sovereign truth from a galactic perspective, exploring our world with new ideas, knowledge, and a promise of a better future. Galactic discussions for galactic-minded people. Andronetalks.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on Andronetalks Radio. And we are going to do the third edition of Life with a Cosmos Clearings. And this is a book that was written by Daniel M. Salter, as well as told by Nancy Redstar. And we have the privilege of having Daniel and Derek here, who are the grandchildren of Daniel M. Salter, and we're going on to chapter 8. I'm just going to review this again because we kind of did this spread out. We didn't, talk about it, like within a week. It's been over months, and so this is, I believe, the third show that we're covering it. We had intentions of doing 4 chapters at a time, but some of these chapters are very rich with content, and I'm glad that we're taking our time to look through it. So without further ado, let's get into it. Welcome, Derek. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. Glad to be here.
Welcome, Daniel. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, glad to be here too.
And Derek and Daniel, you have a radio or a podcast called Shred the Veil, and you want to tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, so Shred the Veil is our show. We do the show monthly on Infinite TV, and there we kind of explore anything that is behind the scenes, behind the narrative, that the mainstream narrative, trying to expose things and uncover the truth, and just getting people to think about some realities they might not have thought of before. Certainly a lot to do with our grandfather, and we talk about our history and where we came from with this information, and talking to like-minded people who have been through similar experiences with UFOs, and but we go beyond just the UFO topic. We talk about spirituality type stuff, all kinds of different things, different types of guests, and just trying to expand people's minds, raise the consciousness.
Yeah, I'd highly recommend your show. We've been able to be on the show a few times already. First myself, and then second with Peter. And we'll talk about that later when we get a little closer to the wing makers topic, which is on here. So today we're going to address the eighth chapter, and it talks about 7. It's called the Star Wars Project, right? Star Wars,
yeah. Yeah, this probably is, well, it has a lot of documentation in it, so it kind of ends up being one of the longer chapters, I guess. But he really does break things down. Jessica, I don't know where you want to start, but yeah, he really does break things down into the where the NRO fits into all this and all the different agencies, intelligence behind it. Yeah.
I will say this from the beginning. I said this book, everyone should have a copy of this book if you want to have a breakdown of whatever has happened regarding the entire experience of the government, exploring UFOs and what has been happening. Obviously, we've had UFOs for many years, even like colonial times, I've seen UFOs. And throughout like the early 1900s, 1800s, there were actually news articles about UFOs. And then suddenly everything comes to a full halt and it stops. and then we discover there's a reason why. Your grandfather did an excellent job providing documentation, because a lot of people in the won't say conspiracy theory group, but those that want to know the truth about ufology and the history and the breakdown of our government interaction, not just our government, but many other governments. But in particular, you see it goes back and forth between us and Russia. But there are, some documentations here that people can read through and see exactly, because a lot of people believe it. But it's nice to have everything right here. Look at that. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
You need a little bit of a magnifying glass to read it, but it's a little hard.
Yeah, it's good eyes. But this chapter in particular, this chapter 8 on Star Wars, he called it. It's really intricate in a lot of the different agencies and the structure of the secret government. And when I first read this information in the book, when it first came out, it was hard to follow because it didn't really mean a lot to me, because I didn't really know a lot of these organizations, or I hadn't heard anything about them. Over the past 20 years, being in this community more and more people coming out with information, these names of these different organizations and the various stories behind them, now that I'm looking at it now, it kind of all makes sense. And it just still blows my mind that he was putting this all out there, over 20 years ago. And some of these things are just coming to light in more of this community that we hadn't seen before. So it's really, really impressive. And just to see it all laid out here, there's so much detail about the specifics of how they all interrelate and who reports to who and how they were created. It's really fascinating. I hope we can do it justice here, trying to explain it or talk about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so I think the Star Wars, for people that aren't familiar with that, he just explains in the very beginning that's known as, for the military, within the military, it's the Space Defense Initiative, or SDI, and it has to do with the missile defense systems around, I guess, the globe. And I'm not sure if it's strictly the U.S. I think it is, developed through U.S. and what they were doing, but I don't know if it was ever clear. I'm sure at the beginning it was just basically for missile defense for anything within any threats from other countries and nations. And I believe in the Disclosure Project, there was one gentleman, John Maynard, or I think his last name is Maynard. I'm just trying to go off the top of my head, but he's talked specifically. He actually talks about the NRO because he had an idea of what that was, and nobody else really, besides our grandfather, talked about it and said he claimed to be a part of that organization. So this guy explained it a little bit, and he explained some other conversations about Star Wars and the fact that, he was asking questions within intelligence, within that organization about, well, why are there so many of these satellites in this program pointing into outer space if we're worried about threats on the Earth? Why are we looking so much into the space about? And then they would just kind of brush it off and say, well, you have to have a need to know about that kind of thing. So that's obvious.
The story, the Space Defense Initiative, it was definitely a cover story for what we're really doing, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
The chapter begins with your grandfather saying, the first sighting I and my crew had was of 3 extraterrestrial crafts on top of a radar tower in Warner Robins Air Force Base in Georgia. Seeing the zero acknowledgement and the blackout of the report, I then suspected that the Air Force and CIA were covering up more incidences. That is when I began my own search and was convinced that other people were also having encounters. He doesn't say exactly what year that is, but
that was in 1949 when he had his first encounter. Yeah, when he actually just started in the military, and I know that opened his mind for sure, and led him to do a lot of research and a lot of digging around, and eventually led to him being a member of the NRO once he retired from the Air Force. So he was able to get to the various levels through the black projects and throughout his career to be able to have access to that and become an operative there.
Yeah. And I do believe that the ETs actually kind of pull people in too that they trust. And so he sort of, it looks like the government is handpicking or hand selecting certain people, but I believe that there is also an other influence that's going on at the same time. And so there are people that, you know, are able to be through this whole duration and disclosure or experience witnesses of the events and, you know, patterns and different things, because ultimately it comes out as a message, the reason why they're showing up, right? So as you go further on and through the chapter, you see that there's more involved. Interesting, because we have that whole series of fantasy TV show movies, Star Wars, right? And it came out, it was huge.
Right.
And it was definitely a soft disclosure of everything that's going on. And undoubtedly it was named after this project, or in agreement with the government to, you know, subtly leak information, making it look like it's off-world bases and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just looking through some of my notes because I just kept on saying, wow. So Star Wars, which is popularly thought of as a missile defense system, just like you said. And then there was no interference from emerging extraterrestrial population or race of people. What the network's directive means is that without being asked, no nation, military complex, or governments will interfere with the development of evolutionary progress of a race from another planet or solar system.
And
so they
the
start to
prime
lay out.
Yeah, he's specifically talking about the prime directive, right? So just like the Star
Yeah.
Trek.
It starts, the discussion begins with what their stance is if an extraterrestrial group comes here. They even go further. So Oppenheimer, right, starts laying everything out. Now Oppenheimer starts to actually create parameters, doesn't he?
Yeah.
He starts saying,
right. Yeah. And here there's a letter that he wrote to actually Albert Einstein about, you know, how the Earth was going to operate and how we were going to act as a global community with respect to treating life with extraterrestrials on this planet. And they specifically talk about, he mentions that he's talking about the spacecraft are currently flying in the atmosphere when this letter was written, and that the military has fully accepted that and not acknowledged that they're there. And his concerns are about, you know, us having atomic bombs and using that technology and potentially having impacts in other parts of the universe that we're not aware of. So he was back then, you know, had, you know, a sense or a feel for what the impact of the atomic energy could do with the you know, nuclear weapons. And right. So he was definitely very concerned about that for sure.
And he also mentions that perhaps that's even why these races started to come down and be around at that time, because of what we were doing and testing. And if I right. think if he happened to be a part of MJ12, then he would know a lot more than what's just here. But
well, they said he was an informant to, or an advisor to MJ12. But yeah, it doesn't look like he's in the know as far as how deep MJ12 was at the time when he wrote this.
Right. Okay.
But he did have an awareness. I mean, this is the man who referred to himself as the destroyer of worlds because of some of the test bombs that he did.
Yeah.
Right.
And what he knew, what he did find out from the ETs, is that you do not have permission to create these type of bombs because they do affect other worlds. It does. Right. Because it goes into a quantum space. Then it can, you know, go in and damage or cause other problems. And you see something like that happening in Fringe. I don't know if you're familiar with the series Fringe, where they actually, they're going back and forth between parallels, and one gets destroyed because of another. and they're feeling that effect. It's a very, very interesting dynamic that we should be aware of. And so essentially ETs were informing them, you do not have permission. You don't realize the effect of what you're doing.
Yeah, our grandfather mentions that a lot throughout the book, that they specifically warned all the governments of the world that, not to weaponize space, no nuclear weapons in space. And then they've deactivated nuclear missiles going into space, and they've also missiles on the ground. They have the capability of doing that.
The ETs did that.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
That's been a lot of cases like that. I heard that even the Challenger, when the Challenger blew up, one of the main reasons was because they had some kind of weapon or something, and that I think they were actually, what I was told from or heard from a recent interview, that's one of the reasons why there's that issue there. But I think there's might have been other stuff going on as well. But that was interesting to know.
So here's something I wanted to bring up, because there's you can call them naysayers, and it's almost like there's people in different spectrums of the truth movement, and those that want disclosure. And so you have people that are like, yes, we have the capability of space travel. And then there are others that say, the Stanley Kubrick idea that, well, he created a film that replicated us on the moon. And so you have people that go to that extreme, but they don't realize that that is all part of the government doing something over here and then putting it out as a false
and that was
event.
I think he actually mentioned that in this chapter. He actually did mention the fact that the fake alien invasion, and that even the flag, the filming was fake footage. Of the filming was, of course, and like he said, there's wiring in the flag so they try to make it maintain the flag whatever position. But he said, like, matter of fact, as if he had that inside knowledge of what was actually happening. But he said that was the whole point of what the government does, is they put out some form of truth or some version of it, and then they smear it, they make disinformation out of it, so that the public completely gets thrown off, gets confused, and then just has apathy, becomes apathetic, and doesn't really want to follow it anymore because it's just too much. And we've seen that the past 50, 75 years has been nothing but that. So.
Well, the problem is we'll put out information, and not just us, but others as well. And then there's always like a handful of comments. Oh, that's fake. That's always been fake. And, and yes, they're right, but there is another part of it. And so that's the part that if we could just kind of get the community to recognize this whole chapter is brilliant in providing data, is some proof in how they were doing this and why they were doing it. And there's a continuation of a statement that's made for the Star Wars program, or any of these other programs, whether it was Majestic 12 or Majestic 12. It's, in essence, they had a book for them, a study guide, and then at the bottom it says, by the way, you don't exist, in their own words.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah, it was I think it was a training book. Let's see what page that was.
It was at the end of the chapter. Yeah.
Yep.
And it's interesting that stamp, we mentioned that stamp, but whatever these documents are, wherever he must have photocopied them, it looks like they're not like the best quality, but then he has that stamp of the Interplanetary Phenomenon Technical Unit that he personally had, and it would stamp all the documents he had, and that he would.
This was page, I have on page 133, and you can see the page.
Yeah. Exactly.
And at the bottom, or it's sort of at the bottom, before you get to the history of the group, it says, no information is released to the public press, and the official government position is that no special group such as MJ-12 exists, or MJ-12 exists.
Yep.
And it says on the top here, top secret, majestic or magic Eyes Only, Chapter 1, Operation Majestic 12. And I don't know if you can see that. I'll share that with everyone.
Right.
So
it's funny you were just mentioning Stanton Frieden, but that I think he was well known for trying to go over the MJ12 document that existed and whether it was real or not real, and that was kind of a big part of what he was doing within the movement.
Yeah, the documents came forward publicly in like the early '80s, and everyone was trying to say it was say it was bogus. The FBI did an investigation, and they officially stamped it as falsified documentation and all this stuff. But yeah, I mean these I don't know if this is the same documents, but this here is from 1954. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
what the document of
That the manual, the operations manual, the special operations manual that you were looking at.
Yeah. That's page 133. Hold on a second, I'll get it. It's hard for me to read it. Let's see if I could find a date, but I don't know if there was an actual date on this. There might. Oh wait a minute. 1947.
Was established
September 24th, 1947.
Yeah.
Classified presidential order of
Right.
MJ12. Recommended Secretary of Defense Forestal and Dr. Vannevar.
Vannevar Bush.
Vannevar Bush.
So they were
Chairman.
officially in the program. Yeah, exactly. And then he goes on to talk about Forestal's death just after. It's in part of the same chapter where he discusses how it was obviously he was killed, but they made it seem like it was a suicide. He mentions the bed sheet they had put around his neck, threw him out the window, and it broke, and so it broke and he fell. He was still alive on the floor, on the ground outside the hospital, but they made sure he was dead after that. And he talked about that in an interview, one of his interviews that's out there in the public domain. We found that on YouTube too. So.
Yeah,
then,
I mean, he says it right here in that chapter.
Quoted the operations manual again. That other document. He said MJ12 takes the subject of UFO, extraterrestrial technology, and extraterrestrial biological entities very seriously, and considers the entire subject to be a matter of the very highest national security. And obviously, when Forestal wanted to come forward with this in the public, he was terminated, even though he was one of the original Majestic 12.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, they were, according to the documentation here, they said their primary concern, it was people, sort of. They didn't want people to know. They wanted to be willing to have like colonies of ETs or have, all sorts of things happening, but they didn't want the public to know. They thought it was a breach of national security if a lot of it had to do with the Russians because they were so competitive with the Russians. And it kind of, you see the interplay of that going back and forth just in the chapter alone, and who had information about what. And the Russians were kind of ahead of them in the game of space travel, but at the same time, then they hit a lot of financial struggles and were not able to stay up with the Americans. They weren't able to keep up with their technology and some of their experimentations. But what the Russians did have was a whole lot of documentation about ETs.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And then at some point later, right, they, because of their lack of funds or the change of the regime of who was running the nation, those that maybe they wanted some money and they sold some of these documentations, which
Right, yeah.
I think happens often between governments.
I just made a connection. I didn't realize this, but you just mentioned that date from that Majestic 12 and the history of that group. Well, if you go back to page 113 and look at that Truman memo, that's the same date Truman, that director, that Truman actually was writing to Forestal that everything related to this subject should be between you, Dr. Bush, Vannevar Bush, and Director of Central Intelligence, therefore basically classified. So he's basically saying that's when MJ12. Yeah.
Yeah.
The president's giving the order to keep it under full secrecy.
Yeah, basically giving the power to MJ12 and keeping it out of anyone else's knowledge.
Exactly.
But your grandfather even talks about how they were discussing about different things that they had seen. He was working. This is towards the end of the chapter. He was called in to do a presentation. There were all sorts of representatives from different nations, and they were dressed in civilian clothing. They didn't look like they were necessarily military, so he didn't know who they were. But there was another a mechanic engineer that was trying to work on the equipment, and the guy started talking about what he saw. And your grandfather said, he came right out and said, I was afraid. Not that there were ETs, but he was afraid that if the government heard them having this discussion, that they could get hurt. And so there was, a legitimate fear of being careful what's being said.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely.
He mentions Philip Corso Jr. testified about his father, Philip Corso, who wrote, of course, that he was part of the Army intelligence during I guess way back during Eisenhower, but part of the foreign technology division. Yeah, something like that. But he had the book called The Day After Roswell, and that's the book I have. And I think even my grandfather had that beforehand. But
wearing a Roswell shirt, because we went there as well. And I'll tell you, it was a weird place. It's a very weird place. One of these days I'll share it with the public. But I remember when we were driving in, and they say that I believe Roswell was is it northeast, but where it actually happened, not in the actual town.
Right.
And we were driving through, and I honestly, there was like this weird cloud around us that was like through the whole, that whole section. And it was almost like we were getting, have problems with our technology a little bit. And we didn't know, it might have been the location, but I was like seeing all sorts of really weird things, and it was dark and it was rainy. But when you look at the cloud, it almost looked like a mushroom top. You know what I mean? It sort of like was hovering over us for a period of time. And when we got into the town seemed more touristy. Everything had an ET or a little green guy somewhere.
Yeah.
But
yeah, exactly.
The activity was definitely on the highway.
Yeah, I always thought this was interesting. He, our grandfather talks about the where he was in the NRO. He was part of the scientific and technical unit, planetary phenomena, and the only other place that I actually have heard that term was he says, that unit was investigating Roswell when it happened, and that it had been developed, about 5 years earlier from another crash. I think it was in California somewhere. There were a couple of crashes where they developed the that unit, and they were in charge of investigating extraterrestrial and UFOs. And then here in the book, this document he has is pretty much a report of what happened at Roswell. It talks about the ETs and describes them and everything. It was like an eyewitness report of what it was, and it was the document is Interplanetary Phenomena Unit. So, I mean, I certainly gives credibility to that unit actually did exist, and it kind of makes sense. It was started way back then when all this came about.
This is on I think it's on this page right here. 116, does that sound right?
Yeah.
Page 116, and has a discussion about Roswell.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 75 miles northeast of actually the town is where the incident was supposed to have occurred. They have a big military base there in the town, by the way. I don't know if people recognize that. But I was, you could definitely see their presence there as well.
Mhm. Yeah.
But here
and
again, go ahead.
Right. Yeah, no, I was just saying he doesn't make the connection in this chapter, but I believe he said that the unit that did the investigation, they are, they, when the NRO was formed, that they fell into the NRO as part of the NRO.
Yeah, and there was another interesting thing that happened out of that. I think a bunch of people, there were deaths, suicides, the people that were involved in this investigation. There were civilians and military personnel involved with this recent recovery operations. I'm just sorry, excuse me, I'm having a hard time reading. The access with proper security and clearances through several suffered from nervous breakdowns, resulting in committing suicide. And you wonder if this wasn't a way to kind of, there were security functions went very well. The ground personnel suffered in experiences of forms of contamination resulting in deaths. So you wonder, was this or was something that naturally happened from exposure to those locations? Or was this a way to kind of cull out those that had too much information?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a really interesting document. It talks about that General Eisenhower was going to be shown, get a showing of the recoveries sometime that year with a limited briefing at the Pentagon from Hoyt Vandenberg, who was also an original member of MJ-12. I think a lot of the original members of MJ-12 were involved with this incident. That's how they got very quickly to become part of that group.
Right.
It also says James Forestal would be given a briefing as well as the new Secretary of Defense, and that it had become known, some of the recovery operation was shared with Representative John F. Kennedy. So they knew that Kennedy had somehow gotten the information. It didn't say how or who he talked to. At that time, he was a naval officer.
Well, JFK was a congressman at the time when he came in.
Yeah, but he was in the military.
Massachusetts Democrat, elected to Congress. Yeah.
He had already been in the military, so he had gone over the world. He had been with Forestal, I believe, right after World War II, and he went over and he got to see. He was in the Navy, so he got to see kind of what the aftermath of the war was and some of the Nazi bases. I don't know how much he got read in, but I'm sure he was familiar with some of that.
JFK was very, very intelligent. He really had, was able to gather enough information, but also came from an elite family, essentially. Joe and I'm a native Bostonian, so we know a lot about the Kennedys.
Yeah.
And, that there was his father was very active in a lot of different things, including celebrities, just like he was later on in the years, or maybe earlier than we think. But I think that he was extremely bright and very, very interested in all different types of topics, including this. So I don't doubt, like I said, I think they handpick who they want to be running the nation and who they can work with, and people that already have the knowledge so that they don't have to, someone that's kind of, I want to say, for lack of better words, groomed for the role.
Yeah.
Yeah. So to find him in here was not very surprising. I mean, it makes a lot of sense why he was brought in, especially since he was, they have a certain family lineage. If you can connect all of the presidents to the similar family, and he wasn't in that group.
Okay.
Oh, he wasn't.
And I don't believe he was. I believe, because he came from Irish ancestry. And so I think that because of his knowledge and everything, and even still today, you hear like groups talking about JFK, and Trump always refers to him, and JFK Jr. And yeah, so there's definitely a strong, and well, we have Robert Jr. running for office now.
Right.
Which is the first time a Kennedy's run for office in a very long time.
Yes. That's the only reason. If I was going to vote Democrat, I would vote because he was running. That's about the only reason.
I actually liked him. I always liked him. I mean, like I said, we've been seeing him throughout the years when nobody was really looking at them, and he's one of those guys that he had this like company where he would help out the poor that didn't have heat during the winter, and he would supply oil for them. They had a nonprofit, and everybody liked him. He would make sure that everyone was taken care of them, if people met the criteria or whatever. But, it was one of those where it wasn't just like some kind of ambiguous like nonprofit, but he was helping. I'm not promoting anyone for office, but I'm just saying somehow the topic came up of the Kennedy family. They're very interesting. But getting back to, some of these things, you see, Oppenheimer, you see Einstein, you see JFK, you see your grandfather is there as a witness, observing all of these things happening. And then Truman, Eisenhower, and then Russian leadership. Yeah. And all of these people that were integral, like you said, Forestal and many others that were integral and providing this information, who wanted to, reveal it to the public. And I actually just, someone sent me a video that showed a bunch of people that, died because of their efforts of trying to disclose things. And we were, you do wonder about the way some people have died. I mean, obviously there's no proof, but it does seem very coincidental,
Mm-hmm.
But
interesting list you have. that would be a whole nother topic, just all these people that were involved and how they died. But just to finish up on the Kennedy subject, that there's a Kennedy memo on page 124, and it specifically talks about how he, and this is right before the assassination in November, with like 10 days before, where he's talking about trying to go into a joint effort on the UFO topic, intelligent files, sharing files like that. But he was also known that in lunar exploration as well, trying to go to the moon with Russia, not against them, not as a joint venture instead of a space race. And that would have completely probably dismantled the whole concept of the Cold War and us, keeping them as an enemy. He wanted to get rid of all of that because he knew the CIA was behind most of that anyway, and he wanted to dismember the CIA and break them into 1,000 pieces. So all of that and the culmination of that memo right there is probably a big part of why they tried to get, they were successful at getting rid of him shortly after that.
Yeah, well, they talk about the NRO as kind of taking the reins of everything and trying to push the CIA out of it, and right. Saying that they're in control of all the information, and then they wanted to hire civilians because they wanted to make sure that it didn't come out as like a military or an Illuminati type of situation, but unfortunately they. Towards the end, they do reveal how this disclosure, there is a threat that this disclosure will be brought to the public by the Illuminati in order to create a one world order.
I didn't see that in this chapter as well.
Actually, that is in the other chapter. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead.
Oh no,
on
that's
the
good.
UFO files for sale.
Yeah.
Yeah, but and it's interesting. In this chapter, though, he does talk about the NRO, and it had been under the CIA, and then they tried to eliminate the CIA faction. Kennedy wanted to do that.
Actually,
and then
Eisenhower was trying. Yeah, back in Eisenhower's time.
Eisenhower, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, Eisenhower as Kennedy was coming in, and then again, the NRO kind of became this extremely black hole secrecy kind of veiled organization that no one really knew existed. Earlier in the chapter, he was talking about they actually spied on a lot of the different black projects like Project Blue Book, Grudge, Snowbird, any UFO and space intelligence agencies. They were all spied on by the NRO.
Yeah.
So they kind of went underground until 1997. He said that when they came out as officially existing.
Yeah, so that explains a lot. I mean, we assume that he had these clearances way back in the work, like after his sightings in the early 50s, like when he started to get these clearances. But I think it just made sense that he was brought into the NRO because he was already in having all the intelligence that they had gathered already about UFOs and everything else. So
yeah, well, we talked about high level security clearance, and I mean, it's amazing because that's what it comes down to is those that are observing everyone else in the process. And so there's layers of this secrecy, and then of course, you don't really know who is actually the one that is saying that person is revealing too much information, and who's the one that's actually following them, because everyone just assumes it's the 3-letter organizations, but in fact it could be even deeper, a more silent group or even an international group.
Yeah,
could be
so compartmentalized. Yeah, I think there's interesting. He talks about talking about the different levels of classification. He said there exists a cosmic Q, level 33, and this is the Magi, which came first, which is very interesting. Q and 33. He said then there was Majestic 12, MJ12, which is level 32 and came later. And then in aircraft secret manufacturing, there are directors at level 31. Then on level 30, we have the officials of the Wackenhut group and the 00 boys, followed by the elite group of the Snatcher Snuff, who gets the orders from the Secret Service. He said there's 38 levels to top secret, these different clearances. But, that's like the Men in Black, the Wackenhut, and the people, the contractors that come in and, try to keep things silent through Project Blue Book.
But that's why people try to find Peter. And he's buried in these top secret groups, and he's not really easy to find. And believe me, I've had quite a few people say that they were searching for him and thought they could find him. And the most recent one is, Peter's still living in the Czech Republic. He's in a wheelchair and blah, blah, blah. And I said, someone said that to me, and I said, I've seen Peter. He's not in a wheelchair. I said, but I did have a discussion with Peter about it. And I said, they said something about a wheelchair. He goes, I was in a really, really bad accident that I probably shouldn't have gotten out of. I was in a wheelchair for a short period of time. I said, did you share that story on the radio? And he said, yeah. I said, well, they still think you're there. Wow. I said, but there's a lot of people that are trying to figure out who is who and see if they can track them down and see if they're actually legitimate in the information they're saying. But a lot of the information, like over time, if it's coming true, then obviously the source is pretty solid, So, but for some reason, it takes people, they have to catch up sometimes 10, 20 years before they start to recognize things. Not everyone, but there's a handful of people that, will be very, very skeptical. And even still, right in front of them, they can see something and have that cognitive dissonance and not really want to deal with it. But there are very high, various levels of top secret, and your grandfather was a part of that. and waited until the end of his life before the information came out.
Yeah, and
Yep.
maybe if I don't know, Jessica, we'll talk to you more about what Peter might know about our grandfather. Because maybe stuff that he didn't even want to share in this book, but something that's coming to light, so we'll have to keep digging on and researching on that. But I think the levels of 33, I think that's interesting that level is the majestic 12 level. And I think there's so much Freemasonry tied into who gets into those clearances and who gets to have the know-how. And I think you'll see it throughout NASA. You see it many of the astronauts that went to the moon, all of these things. That there's a lot of the Freemasons or the Masons that were involved. And our grandfather was a Mason, but he never said what level. He didn't claim to be a 33rd degree or anything, but and maybe his lineage did. So that's an interesting.
I don't think they were all Masons. I think, but yeah, there were. It's not just that they're Masons, but there is. When they founded the U.S., they did create some kind of number system and establish that the early Masons did do that. They kind of put an imprint in our government. So whether it was you actually join the Masons or just by being a part of the government, you are by default already partaking in a system that was initially founded by, like you see George Washington was a Mason, and the way that they gridded Washington, D.C. and, all of, you can go deeper in that. And there are people that are more proficient in that knowledge than I am, but yeah. So, but the numbers are important. It's not accidental. And, the references of, what some of these things mean, Peter and I also talk about how in the government they use a lot of like ancient gods and goddesses, for the names of vehicles and different types of projects that they have.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, sure. I really like the book. I've mentioned it before in the past, but it was done by Richard Hoagland and Mike Barra. Both co-wrote the book called Dark Mission about NASA and that program, and all the symbology, all the dates that they launched the certain missions, all of that. There's so many ties. So they're literally performing these rituals as they're going into these missions. It's crazy.
Yeah.
For better or for worse, I don't know. That's not all bad, but I think you're going to have a mixture in there, and at certain levels, who knows? You really don't know what their intentions are, because there's too much secrecy involved.
Yeah, and I think our grandfather did know more than he put into this book. Obviously, I think there's a lot he held back. I've seen some videos that I need to put online, but that I found in a collection of VHS tapes, actually, where he talks about the format of the things that he put together, of the stuff he was disclosing. Was he did it in a way try not to scare people too much, to not make it so overwhelming. And I'm sure there's a lot of stuff that he was fearful of saying, publicly, that if he said he would, he saw people get killed for disclosing stuff like that. So I'm sure he held back quite a bit for that reason as well. But he definitely wanted to present this in a manner where people could, grasp it and not be too overwhelmed, even though there's a lot in here that's pretty shocking. But I think that was his intent on how it's disclosed, and to make sure that people could really get a hold of it and have their minds be expanded, their consciousness expanded, without scaring them off a little too much.
Yeah, I agree. I think he did a great job about that, and I think that was he followed that theme or kind of reasoning how Dr. Stephen Greer did the same. I mean, I think a lot of people love or hate Dr. Greer. I think, what he's done with the community is amazing, but a lot of people don't give him, discredit him, or say, he's not completely, telling the truth, because he wants to say that all ETs are good. There's no malevolent or vicious or nefarious entities out there. Our grandfather didn't really say much about the negative side, but I think at the same time he knew that our interactions and our level of consciousness would be the ultimate, would determine our ultimate outcome as a race. We have to give our consent and our free will to, do agreements with these lower level types of ETs. And I'm sure, and there are, of course, those negative forces out there, but he didn't dwell on that. He just talked about us as a humanity, raising our vibration, raising our consciousness, so that we could interact and we could become a part of the galactic community that we deserve to be a part of, instead of, but I like to make the analogy of us as little kids in the sandbox with nuclear weapons. We're just still down here, and we're not old enough, or to go sit at the big boys table like with everybody else in the universe. It's sad, but that's kind of where we're still at. So.
Right.
I was going to do a quick little share, and I'm going to say something about Stephen Greer too, that I think it took a lot of different people to be able to create to provide disclosure. And so I'm grateful for everyone that contributed. It wasn't just one or two people that were involved. I mean, everyone has done their share, and he put himself on the line, and I respect that. So right. Yeah, if that's his perspective, that they're all good, that's the way he feels, and that's what his interaction has been. I don't see if that's a criteria to discredit him, but unfortunately people don't fully, they don't see the spectrum of how these different steps of different people stepping forward has made a difference. But
for sure.
This article just came out right before we did the show, so I thought that was interesting. 10 UFO investigators who died mysteriously under suspicious circumstances. So we're on some heated topics right here, and look at this. You recognize any names?
John Mack, our grandfather talked about him. Yeah.
Supposedly he was killed by a drunk driver in London in 2004.
That was a big one. He talked about so many cases that John Mack did. His book was called what was the I'm drawing a blank, but there's a famous book that he did regarding just all the sessions that he's done on people to figure out, abductions. It's called Abductions, about if they were abducted and all that. So he did hold him in high regard for sure. Because I think he was actually, John Mack's one of those people that was a disbeliever. He wasn't even into the movement at all. He didn't believe any of it. And then he started actually investigating and doing these sessions and seeing if there's a psychological problem with all these people. As he started to go further and further, it's like, there's too much evidence here. I can't just completely throw this off. Like, there's nothing there.
Right.
Yeah. Was this the book? Was this the original one?
Yeah.
Does that look familiar? That was a revised edition.
Mm-hmm.
Passport to the Cosmos. It looks like he did quite a bit, and he was from Harvard.
Right. He's a really intellectual person and a scholarly kind of person, so he had credibility for sure. So he was a big part of as far as people seeing this in another perspective and maybe taking it more seriously.
Yeah, I had that. I just lost that article. Well, we'll get it back.
I didn't recognize a lot of the names from the top of the list, but as you go down the list, a lot of them are familiar to me, especially Forestal. he's a main one.
Right. Yeah, we talked about that.
The other one was Jessup, Morris Jessup, and I have a book by Joseph Farrell, but he goes big into the Philadelphia experiment, and so Jessup was this name that kept popping up. There's these communications going back and forth, and I think Jessup was the one receiving them from some anonymous source that said he claimed to be a part of the Philadelphia experiment, and this is exactly how it happened. So all these discussions were happening for years with Jessup, and then I didn't know I guess he mysteriously died. I think I wasn't sure what they said it was.
Yeah, it's a good article. Yeah. We'll share it for people to review it afterwards, and kind of gives a brief overview of each individual, of who they were.
That was one of the first things my grandfather told me about on this topic, was the Philadelphia experiment. Back when I was a teenager in the 90s, he talked about time travel and the whole thing with the radar operation and what the Navy was trying to do, and pretty amazing. Yeah, that blew my mind when I was a teenager hearing that and in telling this to me. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ones that they really keep an eye on are those that were eyewitnesses. And they probably, you know, they're warned, and then when they decide to reveal information is when it gets a little touchy or heated for them, as opposed to, and I could be wrong, but you know, someone that is not necessarily an eyewitness or wasn't actually a part of a project, so it's just an individual talking about it. So then they just, you know, create disinformation somewhere and you kind of neutralize it that way for the average person, I believe.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure there's exceptions to the rule if a person gets too close to something that they don't want them to see. So, yeah, there's I'm trying to see, there's so much, you could actually take this chapter and create a book.
Yeah, definitely.
You really could. It would be a small book, but it probably could have, you know, some pictures and some more related to what had happened here. I'm just going over.
I was just gonna say
one last thing on this chapter is the whole organizational layout of all the different organizations he has here with the Star Wars program, and that's really interesting too, how they all interrelate. And you can see the NRO up there, kind of overseeing and. Well,
yeah, it's interesting how it's
fine.
This wasn't created by a grandfather by any means. I think this was came out in like the late 90s by a colonel, somebody, I forget his name. I looked it up, but this guy was part of all the Cheyenne Mountain and all the stuff that happened there, and he was finally willing to just show it somehow, just show that this is the organization chart. But how NRO is right there beside the president of the U.S. and then the Magi, M-A-J-I, all sit there kind of at the top, and then goes down to the other intelligence agencies from there.
Well, they show that the core of it is the Star Wars city,
right,
in Colorado Springs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And everything else goes around it. But I want you to look at the very bottom. There's the Rockefeller Corporation. So, you know, the elite are definitely involved. Definitely, without a doubt.
And all of the aerospace defense contractors, private corporations, all of that. And that was a big leak that a lot of the researchers on the JFK assassination knew, that it was what Eisenhower warned us about, the military-industrial complex. He warned the whole nation, but maybe he was also warning Kennedy, because that's eventually what got him killed. And I think there was even ties to some interview. Somebody interviewed actually the JFK, who was the one that who did the whole trial. He tried to convict Clay Shaw, who was the one person they could pin it on and say that this was conspiracy all the way to the highest level of the government. And so he said that one lawyer, whoever was attorney, names drawn a blank, but he did say that General Dynamics was one of the many, maybe the biggest one of the corporations that was involved.
Yeah. I mean,
in the story of Fringe, right, which is, people think it's just a TV show, but they talk about Boston Dynamics as being a part of everything. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry about that, Dan.
Oh no, I was just saying. I mean, this chart kind of lays out what is the military industrial complex. This kind of spells it out right here. You know.
Yes.
It does, and also remember, keep in mind the thing that really affected the Russians was money, and you can see there had to be money. There's the Rockwell, which is the Rockwell International Enterprises. You have IBM. Like, what's that other time traveler that used the IBM computer? Of course, we know about Lockheed and Boeing, and but yeah, also there's the Japanese company, the Fujika company. So now you have another country involved in the U.S. space program, Star Wars City.
Yeah, and I don't know what Kaman, K-A-M-A-N is. It sounds foreign too. I'm not sure what that is.
Yeah, it does.
I was going to tie, I like that you mentioned fringe, because our grandfather did, he would talk about disclosure. Of course, like you said, there's disinformation everywhere, but they easily put soft disclosure out in all these movies and TV series. And X-Files was a huge one that he mentioned. And that's how I, of course, started watching it from the beginning. And he knew that they were putting stuff intentionally out and actually John D'Souza says that whole first season, he had the file. He was the one that had the files, and they were using all of those files he had within the first season of the X-Files. But I only mention that because the fringe is that was like X-Files 2.0, like for the later generations, because it really was all other forms of disclosure of what they're doing, and the alternate reality stuff was interesting.
Yeah, because then they actually are, active in time travel and going into parallels and in other contexts of existences, which Peter talks about all the time, and jumping from one location to the next.
Yeah. He explains this chart a little bit here in this chapter. He says, all of these different corporations had their own, like Lockheed Skunk Works, their own black projects then, and they didn't tell each other about it. It was only known at the highest levels what each of them was where all that information kind of reported into. None of them knew what the other one was working on. And the Japanese company Fujika was owned by Sony, who was also owned by the Rockefeller Company, and that's where the media comes in. That was the media outlet, and Rockefeller controlling what was shown to the public and not.
What was going to be said, right? Kind of like what Murdoch is doing right now,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But I mean, we don't realize, just by Japan being involved like that. Of course, they had to have known a majority of what was going on, and their space program. They don't really talk about their space program, but they have some very, very advanced technology over there, and androids. From what Peter says, is the androids are really prominent and very, very hard to separate from humans.
I guess it kind of goes into the next chapter. I don't know about Russia in a way. I was just going to say it kind of ties into the fact that Russia was a little bit more open, maybe once the communist wall came down. That's when these files really kind of were exposed, and we could see what they were working, what they knew.
I think in some ways they were competitors, but exchanging information, because the space race was it was very real, and they were, wanted to outdo the Russians, but yet the Russians were always ahead. But it says here on the, what page is that? 137. And the U.S. maneuvered the Soviets into financial collapse. Through there's more information. It starts up here. The KGB was the largest secret police and the espionage force in history. And then the Soviet Union had countless UFO sightings, but during the communist reign, there were no public admission of Soviet interest in extraterrestrial activity, even though files in the hands of the KGB documented UFO crashes and retrieved fragments. With the change of the free market economy, many items never before available found there were in the black market and got into CIA hands. Many KGB intelligent agents from the old regime exchanged classified UFO documents for cold cash from the CIA. In fact, the U.S. government and Russia agreed to maintain secrecy about the extraterrestrial presence and the ET's interest in the nuclear advancements of both countries. So, one thing, and I've heard this for years, is that the ETs show up around nuclear facilities and try to dissolve it and everything.
Right.
And so that, the more nuclear our world became, the more active and the more information that they started to have in exchange. So he has a picture here from the Baltics, and
Right.
it is a triangular ship right there. That was a good
Sure looks like
photo.
one of those TR3 whatever Bs, whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
1968, August 4th, 1968.
Interesting.
So that they in the beginning of the Star Wars program, Russia made the mistake of keeping ahead of the United States. They hawked everything to counter the U.S. Space Defense Initiative. Their wheat, diamonds, oil, even their UFO documents to keep up with America. Mikhail Gorbachev, when leaving the office, admitted that they had gone broke trying to overtake the United States. But there was, this whole thing where they, I think they continue to interact. And I think as globally, people are starting to interact, and then we became heated in war again. So then, that shuts down everything. And then, of course, the nuclear ideas start coming back up again. But
he talks about how there was a Project Paperclip in the United States, where the U.S. brought over all the former Nazi scientists who had been working on the anti-gravity technology and the UFO type stuff. And Russia had a similar program where they got a lot of technology and scientists from Germany post World War II to really advance their program to kind of get us on par with each other as far as black projects and secret space type stuff.
And we talk about a lot of people say, well, why do you talk about the Nazis? And the Nazis were ahead of everyone. And so they got their hands on the information of the Hannibal. And there's a good picture right there.
Yeah, that's a really good picture of it.
Yeah, it kind of dissects the interior, so you can kind of see the layers of technology within it. Here is the incident where I was talking about your grandfather. So on page 141, so I was asked to go over to the facility in Langley Air Force Base when the NSA was bringing in information from a lunar orbiter. I packed up some tools, went to the facility. A couple of officers took me into a very large hangar. As I walked in, there were people from other countries, a lot of foreign people from other countries in civilian clothing, and interpreters with them with security badges hanging around their neck. So they took me into the laboratory. I took a look at the equipment. There was an airman second class in there. I was an airman second class as well. He turned the equipment on and put it through its paces. It didn't do what it was supposed to do, and I saw what was going on with it, and I said to him, we'll have to take this thing out of the lab if we're going to work on it. We can't work on it here in the dark room environment. So he called someone to get some people to come in and move it. And it was about the size of a small apartment refrigerator, and it wasn't something you could easily move. So everyone left the facility, left the dark room, except for the airman second class and myself. And we were waiting for someone to come to remove the piece of equipment. So while I'm there, I said to him, I'm really fascinated with this process. How did they get images from the lunar orbiter to the laboratory here? And he went through the whole process describing the various radio telescopes around the world were linked, and they telemetered the data into Langley. So then he goes on about, describing how they take these little strips and pictures and everything. And then they were digital signature and a grayscale. And then they just keep on making these, then they put all the little images together to create a mosaic, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They talk. So at the end they talk about they found a base on the dark side of the moon.
That's what I was getting to. So yeah, he was showing me how all this worked, and we walked over to the other side of the lab, and he said to me, "By the way, we've discovered a base on the back side of the moon." And I said, "Whose?" And I said, "What do you mean, whose?" And he said, "Yes, we've discovered a base on the back side of the moon." And at that point, I became frightened. Remember, I said that, and I was a little terrified, thinking to myself that if anybody walks in the room now, I know we're in jeopardy and we're in trouble because he shouldn't be giving me this information.
Yeah.
That was actually
That was-
testimony of Carl Wolf from
Yeah.
the Disclosure Project that he was
Yep.
quoting. Yeah.
Yeah, that's Carl Wolf. There's good footage of that.
So tell me about this. I mean, did he have any more information about the dark side of the moon? I mean, did anyone find out that he knew at the time, or was that like towards the end when he started to share with the public?
Yeah, Dan, do you remember any stories? Because I know I didn't have direct information about it. But...
No, I don't think he. Yeah, so nothing until he came out with it in the end, I believe. Yeah.
But he did state somewhere, I believe, in the book where he mentioned that they were there. There was obviously, I just read it. There was basically they told everybody from the missions, the early missions, that look, don't come back here. You guys aren't allowed here. Once they started to go, and that's why we stopped going. And Russia too, that there was just no activity for such a long time. But it's because when we originally landed, those craft were there waiting for us, watching us, and letting us know this is not for you. This is not your it's not your for free reign and for you to call your home. So it was already occupied. So
yeah,
he was aware of that, and that was testimony also by William Tompkins, who came out with a lot of that too.
Yeah,
interesting.
But one more thing about the Russia thing, I just saw in here. So after the Roswell incident, President Truman actually instituted a policy with the Soviet Union to keep them aware of the developments and contacts with extraterrestrials, and the policy was that they would inform each other so that if Earth were ever at risk, they could develop a response to an ET attack. So even back then, Russia was considered in this matter an ally.
Right.
They would have to be. It just makes logical sense, because it's essentially the Earth being at risk or potentially at risk. They didn't know whether there were negatives or friendly, and so that was something that they had to, deal with and figure out.
So it goes back to like the whole secrecy. Why the secrecy? Of course, the technology, we would get so much technology from it, but again, it's these players at the top that have their own agendas, and they can't. If the world knows that we're cooperating with Russia behind like one of the biggest things to ever come about in our current human history, as far as UFOs, and acknowledging that, and we're saying, oh yeah, we're in a Cold War with Russia, and we have to spend millions of dollars and do all this stuff behind the secret scenes and have secrecy. But when it comes to UFOs, they couldn't just come out and say like, oh yeah, no, we're working together. We're completely in agreement, and we have these, kind of mandates in place or whatever it is. Like, yeah.
Well, you think about what could happen if we actually acknowledge the ETs being present with us. It would launch us into an advanced technological stage.
Yeah.
That we would have, more access to technology, free energy, or whatever, what have you, and basic knowledge of our solar system that has not been, available as far as other colonies and different types of civilizations that we're already in contact with, the bases on Mars, and just verifications of a lot of these things in deeper truths. Right. And my idea regarding the prevention of or the non-disclosure seems to be a regular theme of the elite. And they always like to be in the know. They want a handful of people to know, and then the rest of the public to not know. And so, here we just proved that the Rockefeller family's involved. I know the Rothschilds as well. And, they were involved in, those families were involved in the wars. They were involved in, when they need more money, that's how they make more money out of the wars. And everybody's a casualty. It's convenient for them. They're always protected. It's not their family members on the front lines of anything. And so when these explorations and projects or whatever, they need to be at the helm. But what enables them to do that, they constantly are the ones that have the funds to pay for these things, including funding the governments, not just our government, but remember, they're neutral parties. They don't have an alliance for just one nation,
Right.
you know?
Yeah.
So, but and then here in the book, you know, he comes right up and says, well, that their plan is that, you know, they're, if there's going to be disclosure, then it would have to be a one world government. And I'm trying to remember exactly what page that was, but he essentially says it in this book. I'm trying to remember exactly where.
So is he when he says that, is he alluding to like the as a good or a bad thing? Because it can be taken both, I guess.
The only way, well, I don't know. He says it in a kind of like it's just a matter of fact what they were planning on doing, not necessarily that he was agreeing or you know, trying to encourage anything, but that it was something that was going to happen. And I'm trying to remember exactly. I know I put down some notes.
Yeah, I think he was well aware of that agenda and the one world government, and he knew of. It reminds me of Bill Cooper, and all his testimony. But it goes back to what even Wernher von Braun said, and the last threat will be the ET threat. So Project Bluebeam, that's where we're at right now. We're literally, this year is that year of, okay, let's get the public used to the idea of this, so that then we can roll this out and make it a whole nother agenda and another reason. So the secrecy lasted for this long. They know they can't close the lid, keep that tight anymore. So now they need to steer the agenda and the narrative as fast as possible to have this as an open discussion. But now we have a new threat. Now you have more reason to put all this money into the funding of the military-industrial complex and everything else.
Right. Yeah, and even reminds me of Ronald Reagan's famous quote that, you know, if there were, he said, imagine if there were some kind of extraterrestrial threat, how we would put away our differences with Russia, and it would be a different story, and we would come together as a one world kind of thing, hinting at that. Now, yeah, I guess you have to look at the dark and light side of that, and what that really means. If certainly there's the New World Order, Rockefeller, Rothschild kind of objective cabal kind of thing.
I think it comes to this I think it's on page 146, and which is a continuation. This is the other chapter 9, Russian UFO files for sale.
Yeah.
So there was
he's talking about he met with this one guy,
Bon Giovanni.
Yeah, he was who had
from the Vatican, right? Or
yeah.
Says the stock. All right, so it says Bon Giovanni took the. Let me see. We'll go further up. Many Russian cosmonauts had to sign documents agreeing to silence about what they saw and know about the subject. However, at the meeting, they had some kind of meeting. Certain high-ranking Russian officials would like to make a public statement that would break the pact to withhold the truth. The pact made after the Cold War, when the religions and military-industrial nations were determined to stay in power at any cost. The Russian representative said that extraterrestrials are peaceful, good, and powerful, and were preparing humanity for important events that would occur in the near future. Many Russian cosmonauts had to sign documents agreeing to silence about what they saw and know about this subject. However, at a meeting, Bon Giovanni was given photographs by cosmonauts of Vladimir Kovalyonok and Vladimir Askionov. These photographs were taken from the Mir orbiting station and clearly show a cylinder-shaped craft and another craft splitting into smaller ones. Furthermore, the Russians have acknowledged that the extraterrestrials have at times taken active control of military bases to implement the advanced civilization space laws. Bon Giovanni took films and documentation to Washington, where he sent to NASA to handle the UFO matter. Ultimately, a few photos were released. And then he says that ultimately, a few photos were released. Let's say one can obtain them more rapidly through the Library of Congress. Bon Giovanni says that the stock market will crash and religions will be destroyed when the extraterrestrial presence is made public. Then the powers that control the world will weaken, and national governments, economies, the military complex, and private interests of the economic elite will collapse. And if we are to take our place in interstellar space, it will not be with nuclear weapons. And then he says prayer meditation to the conscious contact with the cosmic consciousness.
Yeah. So I guess that's the other side of that kind of one world alignment of if we do have ET contact, what will that actually bring? What will it truly bring? If it's not the false flag of ET invasion, which would be the negative side of it, but the ETs could bring to us globally, where the governments and the elites would lose their power, and so I think that's the perspective they were looking at with it.
Yeah, and the elite are, I mean, they have their hands involved in it, and of course they want to maintain power. They want to retain the power here, and whatever's going on. The Vatican is that's another nation.
Right.
But nation that has had very strong influence over many nations around the world. So there's a lot of ego. There's a lot of power play. There are a lot of those that want to stay in power. There's secrecy. In some ways, secrecy is helpful so that things don't get into the wrong hands, although they have gotten into the wrong hands anyhow.
Right.
And then there's a lot of confusion around what's happening. So if we did get into a galactic war because of, we start off by, getting into some kind of battle that's dangerous, and there's nuclear arms used or something of that effect, and then another group comes in and nobody's going to know what's going on. They're just going to be like, whoa.
Yeah.
Although, sort of, they might just think they're in a movie or it's a simulation of,
right, yeah,
something. But I was talking to someone yesterday about, who wanted to live in a log cabin, and I said, well, I know. I mean, you have to know how to be a survivalist. So, it's not just something you just figure out, as you go. You really need to study and how to survive off of the land and all that. But
right.
I'm not trying to get into fear scenarios, but I mean, realistic ideas. And they had their, during World War II, they had their underground bunkers. People were buying them for themselves, little bomb shelters and things.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting that we're still at that we're kind of right there with that culmination of everything right now. It's kind of the scariest times to be around, but it's the most exciting. I think we have a bright future, but man, it's going to be tough for a lot of people, I think, and the uncertainty with the economy. And it's interesting that the Russians mentioned that, that the economy will collapse once this all comes out in the open, and it's kind of looking like it's all happening at the same time. So, yeah. This
is information from your grandfather that was collected since it looks like the 40s, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So he had some really good insights, and I'm grateful to be able to have this discussion, and I'm grateful for you both for maintaining the integrity of the information and making sure that the public has access to it and continuing to share it.
Yeah, so, I appreciate your interest in it and allowing us to have a place to talk about it. This is great. Yeah. I love these conversations.
Yeah, the community enjoys it a lot. So thank you for being here today. And we'll continue on. We still have a few more chapters to go.
Perfect. Can't wait.
Till next time.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
You have a good day, and thank you everyone for listening. Don't forget we're going to put together the other interviews that we did with Derek and Daniel, and to discuss the life with the cosmos clearing. So don't forget to look below for all those links. And thank you everyone for listening today. Thanks for your support. Don't forget to subscribe, and we will talk to you later. Have a good day. So after I did the show with Derek and Daniel, I had a bunch of articles that were sent to me, and I thought, well, this seems to relate a lot to what we were just discussing. And especially, you know, how we said ETs would show up or things would happen, you know, interestingly happen during an effort to maybe go into space, and it would be aborted or have a problem. And here was this lightning bolt that struck. And that was on the Falcon Heavy, the payloads, the ground support equipment, everything was affected by it. And so I think here's some other, you can see the lightning bolt come down. And of course, you know, it's somewhat equipped to be able to handle it, but it's just the idea that, you know, I think these things are set as a warning, whether it is, you know, another government doing something like that, or, you know, Mother Nature or the ETs or someone is complaining that that facility is there, or they're planning on doing something that is not approved of. Another article that came in yesterday, even though it was set for March 13th, 2023, but it was related to what we were talking about, the UFO photo that was taken and is finally, after being classified for over 30 years, and they show Roswell, but actually it's not in Roswell. It is in the edge of Scotland's Cairngorms National Park in Perth. And so I thought what really stood out to me is this picture right here, that it isn't exactly, but was somewhat reminded me of page 138 of the book Life with a Cosmos Clearance. And so if you go to page 138, you will see that there is a triangular looking spacecraft, and we showed that during the show. And lastly, I ended up turning a show into this last night because I was pretty stunned. Here again, we were talking about what's real and what's fake, and what is intentionally sent to distract people and or to, you know, disarm any thoughts about a certain issue so that people no longer pursue it. And here is another example of it. So the Brevard County Commissioners meeting at Cape Canaveral, Florida, and they were having public hearings on the topic. And so people are just, you know, this one gentleman is saying, you know what, we're seeing strings, we're seeing all sorts of different gadgetry here that looks like more of a Hollywood set rather than in space. We're seeing bubbles showing that it's underwater. So this coincides with our conversation. I thought, well, maybe this is a message from Daniel Slater letting us know that he hears us or he approves or something. But it's nice to have that feeling or thoughts of confirmation. So thank you for listening, everyone.
You have been listening to Andronetalks Radio. Join us on YouTube channel Jessica Arael Marrocco, and visit her website at www.readingsbyarael.com.